And now I will actually hand over to Mr. Cyber of NCI Agency. You know that we did a merger in the organization. We were 5 agencies, are now 1. And actually in the beginning of this year we made a final step in this reorganization to basically put all people that do the same work in the same team. And the cyber team is actually led by Ian West. And Ian is now responsible for the full life cycle in cyber, for capability development and services. So if there's anything going wrong with NATO when it comes to cyber, I get a call, but he has to fix it. So Ian?
That's true. Thank you, Ken. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, well, that's my presentation for later sorted out. Thanks to the General Manager for giving you that. But welcome again. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's probably my favorite time of the year, I have to say, a chance to meet up with so many old friends, make new friends, and talk for 3 days about the stuff that keeps us busy during the day and keeps us awake too many nights. It is my pleasure now to introduce the first of our industry speakers, a good friend. He's the VP and Chief Technology Officer for FireEye. He's also been a leading light in 1 or 2 other leading security technology companies too. He's also a graduate of the Vendor School of Etiquette. And I know this to be true because he let me beat him at golf on Sunday. So it is at my privilege to introduce you to Greg Day. Keep your head down and full swing.
Thank you, Ian. I think I got through the first challenge there, which is getting up the steps without tripping over. And what Ian didn't tell you is I've just recovered from a fractured ankle, so I'm feigning injury, as well as obviously making sure that my customers come away satisfied. So it's a great pleasure to be back here at the symposium another year, and I think it's a great time with the announcement of the new facilities being developed to also look at how we see the cyber landscape changing. And really what I wanted to spend was just a bit of time this morning looking at just what is that transition that we're going to see in the next few years, and actually what will that mean to us? Is this just the next evolution in our cybersecurity strategies, or actually do we need to now go through a bit more of a revolution in the way that we're thinking? And of course, to start that journey, I think we need to understand what the threat really looks like now and what it's actually going to morph into in the next few years. Now, in many ways, it's interesting because we talk about information sharing and information exchange. And I'm going to challenge a bit this morning just what is actually valuable within that exchange. But what I wanted to start with is just what's going on in the world. And in many ways, you sit in a very closed view of what's happening. But what I've got to start here is just a view of what we see happening in this broader, we kind of band into categories, defense and government space. And let me start off by explaining a little bit of this. One of the challenges that FireEye typically offers when we go out to organizations is we say, let's look at just where you are today. Around the world, we spend about $30 billion per year putting in software, hardware to protect and enable our IT infrastructures. And you like to think that we do a pretty good job of it, and now we've invested all of that time and energy. But actually what you could see over a 6-month period, we went into 31 different organizations within this industry space, and what we found was 100% of them were compromised in some way or form. And in one way, I think that's very unsurprising, because our worlds are so complex, whether it's human failure, whether it's technology failure, whether it's part of the supply chain. But in another way, there's probably a real challenge there that says we've spent a long time building out these different defensive layers, these friction capabilities to enable our organizations. And so the key part of this for me was, what's really going on? What's happening? If I were talking to you, I think probably 4 years ago, we were talking about things like Stuxnet, the real change in the landscape. This idea of an organization spending years developing something that was so advanced, so sophisticated, and so focused that realistically would have got through any of the controls that we had at that time. Well, the reality we're seeing today is a far more blurred world, which is the techniques, the tactics, and procedures that were developed from that have become far more mainstream. And so what we see now is whether it's exploits being used day in, day out, typically they'll start with the known, the simplest, and look for those weak points, and then slowly developing up through their arsenal, using that persistence until they get into organizations. And specifically looking within the space, whether it's using true APT capabilities, and by far in the way that we see more real APT attacks here than anywhere else, or actually leveraging those capabilities back into the world that we're probably more comfortable with. Now let me kind of give you just a very quick, simple example of this. So you may have come across last year, Operation Clandestine Fox. And so this was an attack that used a brand new unknown vulnerability to gain access into systems organized by one of the very well-known, certainly by us, APT crews that was all about stealing high-level intelligence. And I suppose maybe here's just a good kind of moment to stop and reflect and give you an anecdote as to why the kind of intelligence we gather is so critical. So I actually dealt with one of the organizations that was a victim as we went through this process. And they were one of the very first to deal with this. And at the time, the person that came in to lead the security for this organization was actually just a few days into his new job. And if you think about it, when you're the new guy in, you've got some scope. So imagine being the new guy in the door, and the first thing you find is the organization's compromised. Actually, that made him the hero in many ways. New guy in, found the problem, pulled together the right resource to better understand it, to understand the implications and what they needed to do. And as you'd expect, they pulled in a lot of skill to go do the forensics analysis, to understand how it had moved through their architecture, but then also to be able to gather the forensics to go back to part of their supply chain and their ecosystem to pass on and share that information about what they needed to do to respond. Now, 6-9 months down the line, he moved from being the hero almost to being the villain. And you might wonder why. What changed? Well, the simple reality for that was, at that point in time, they didn't actually stop to understand who was behind that incident. And if you think about it from a defensive perspective, there's really two parts to the problem. One is actually getting rid of the problem, but the other part is understanding what else do I need to do in my response strategy to get back to normal. And if you don't understand the adversary that you're facing, and actually what they're going to do with that intelligence that has been gathered, then you can't start to quantify the longer-term implications. And I think that's a valuable lesson that we can all learn from that. So let me kind of give you a flavor of just how the problem has changed and what that's going to mean to us from a security and from an intelligence stance. And I think any of you that have been in the security industry for a number of years, let me ask this, how many of you have been dealing with cyber for at least 10 years? That's a good kind of chunk of the room. We've all been sat still for a long time. I like to get people moving a bit. So you'll all have seen things like this. This is just a kind of a typical view of the last 6 months of what we had seen as FireEye. And you'll see there the ongoing different campaigns of attacks. And what we're seeing is multiple hundreds of instances of organizations being compromised. And at any one point in time, there's always 1 or 2 campaigns that are very prolific. So there's that kind of real high kind of spike growth, and then just kind of the ongoing mainstream. And these things typically succeed because as much as we try and apply good hygiene and good best practice and good procedure, they get in through the gaps in our environment. Now, the interesting bit of this is, for me, what's important is not the infiltration. Typically, that's automated. Actually, what is far more important is the exfiltration. It's interesting, I heard the comments earlier, and I hear this so often, you know, we've got to be faster, it's a moment in time. But actually, that infiltration, it is a moment in time, but typically it requires a human to be sat at the other end of the keyboard once they've got in, to then be able to move around your estate, to move around your information, those petabytes of data, to figure out what's of value and exfiltrate it out. So what I've got here is that same 14-week period of command and control communication, ongoing compromise of those systems. And what you see here is pretty well, I think, what most of us would expect to see, which is there is a sustained compromise really driven by volume. You can see the maximum 14-week window there. There were still organizations that were fighting that hygiene problem right till kind of the end of that scope, and I suspect some would be fighting it for months more. Now let's compare it to kind of how we see the world changing. And this to me is the real growth area. Take those kind of same traditional malware concepts, but now you start to personalize it more. So what I've got is all of the things that we saw leveraging the techniques, tactics, and procedures that come from APTs. Hopefully the first thing you start to see here is the scale in the graph has now changed. We've moved from hundreds of organizations that are compromised down into tens. So the volume shrinks significantly. And what you can hopefully also see there is a lot of these campaigns are now very short. We've moved from something that ran for months and months and months down into some of these, a lot of them literally, it's a week and then it's done. And so the good news is when we find these things, once we find them, they're done and we move on. But you can see now a far more kind of spiky graph here in terms of that callback. If we find them, we shut them down, we get rid of them, and it's done and we move on. If we haven't found them, then you see this kind of ongoing sustainment, but actually you can see here the maximum length of compromise where they were found was 7 weeks. Whereas in the traditional space, it went all the way through from start to end. So why is this happening, and what does this mean to us from a strategy perspective and from an intelligence perspective? Well, if I were to go back a year ago, I personally showed a graph last year that was kind of somewhat similar to this, where we looked at what we'd seen. And just to kind of put some context in here, we're seeing about 115,000 new attacks every single month. That's no great surprise. If you talk to any security vendor, that number continues to exponentially grow with all of the automation. But what's key here is breaking down the number of different victims for each of those attacks. And what you can see is the left-hand bar basically means that that attack was found in purely one organization. And we've moved, there's a pretty significant shift in just 1 year. A year ago, about 69% of what we saw was unique to one organization. Now it's 84%. And so if I were to give you kind of one prediction over the next 4 or 5 years to when we get to 2020, I think that needle's going to move further. I think we're going to be up in the high 90s of attacks that are truly unique, and I think the volume is going to grow exponentially as well. Now it starts to challenge what is useful intelligence. If I'm sharing with you just the indicators of what's happened to me, it's useful so I can understand the campaign behavior, but the likelihood the version that hit you is going to be different to the version that hit me. So what I have to be able to figure out is how do I join the dots together to see whether this is a campaign, to see who's behind it, and what's actually going on. Now, just to kind of give you a flavor of what does this mean from a strategy perspective, I started life, as Ian said, in different parts of the industry. I've worked for McAfee, I've worked for Symantec, and my roots literally started in developing antivirus software. And there's a huge breadth of different technologies out there, but most of them have been focused on a singular premise, which is one fell for the greater good. Somebody had to see it, somebody had to have the right reconnaissance tools to do the discovery, to go, here's something that looks bad. And I'm going to gather that information up, and I'll pass it up, and it will be shared up into the security industry. We collaborate to then give you the defensive controls. Now, think about it. As the attack gets more and more unique, if it hits just one organization, then by the time they find it and share it back up for the greater good, they've already been hit. And if it's not going to hit anybody else after that, building out my signature set has somewhat limited value. Now, don't get me wrong, there are millions and millions of the en masse attacks still going on out there, and they do a brilliant job in that. But when I start to look at just this unique focus space, what you can see here is just the blue bit at the top is where at least one traditional vendor actually was able to discover it up front. And that, to me, is a distinct change in how we start to focus. What is it that we need to be able to do? We need to be able to do our own self-discovery, because if we wait for somebody else to find the problem and give us the solution, it's too late. So what's the summary takeaway of this for me? The key point is, if I think about measures of success, and I spend a lot of time with different organizations talking about how do we measure the success of cybersecurity. It's very easy to get drawn into what I would call volumetrics. Yesterday we saw 1 million events and I stopped 998,000, so therefore I only had a 2% miss ratio or a 0.5% miss ratio, and it's pretty easy to feel confident in, we're catching the mainstream. But actually the reality for me is less is more. Because if it's, and there's a great example recently, you probably saw in the media, game overs use. This was the first time I had seen law enforcement collaborate internationally around the globe to say, here's organized crime that is encrypting consumers, businesses, military, anybody's data, indiscriminate, and then holding them to ransom to get it back. And it was so visible that law enforcement, the security industry, and industry per se, came together to shut this thing down. Now you think about it, the more voluminous it is, the quicker it's going to become visible. If there's billions of instances, somebody's going to find it pretty quick. If it's voluminous, its goal has got to be generic. It's got to go after something that every single one of us has. And the reality is, whilst that's painful at an individual level, from a cyber defense perspective, the impact's going to be negligible. Then I go to the other end of the spectrum. If somebody has taken the time and effort to write something unique to bypass your security controls, they've obviously taken the time and effort to figure out you have something of unique value that they want access to. So for me, less is more, because the lesser it is, the more focus there is on getting something of value that's unique to your environment, and actually less typically means the longevity is going to be greater because you don't have 1 million eyes looking for it. It comes down to just your skills and your intelligence and your capabilities. Now, if we put some kind of timelines behind this, and again, this is kind of the industry en masse, we talk about a moment of time. And I often think that security breaches are a bit like somebody firing a gun. It's that kind of trying to catch a bullet in mid-flight is unless you're Superman, impossible. And that's what we try and do, though. We try and build up friction layers to kind of stop this happening real time. And yet I think we do that at the behest of accepting that at times we will be compromised. And therefore we have to look, rather than looking at what's coming towards us, we have to look over our shoulders and see what's already happened. And it's pretty shocking. A year ago, the median time to discover an organization was breached was 243 days. In a year, we've improved by 14 days. It's now 229. But if I looked and said, where can we make the most difference? It's not in stopping the attack getting in. It's in discovering that the attackers already got in and marginalizing down the time they have to go do discovery and exfiltration from our organizations. And you can see, these weren't because we had bad security controls in place. Everybody had, all of these organizations we spoke to had great security hygiene, but the attacker had spent enough time to write something that was personalized enough to bypass those controls that were based on cumulative experience. Now, if I start to think of the output of this, and I've already alluded to this, the key part of this for me, and I'll kind of give you some stats in a minute, is this is only ever going to get more and more voluminous. And it's interesting, when we were at the Budapest event earlier this week, I saw another industry speaker that runs a big SOC talk about today, typically they work with their customers, getting from 1 million events per day down to 2. It's a pretty tough call. 1 million security events every day coming into a SOC, and a team's trying to filter these down to 2, because that's really what I have the resource to action. How do I decide which 2 are the right 2? And this is where I think we have some skill to evolve in our capabilities. Because we look at it typically from the technical capability. Yeah, I can see these different bits going on, and I pulled it together, and it looks really sophisticated, therefore, that should be my primary goal. But actually, to me, the biggest multiplier in this is who is behind it, and what is their motivation. So the area we need to build out our intelligence capability is the context that goes with it, not the sophistication. Now, I thought I'd share this with you, because there's one final part that's really key for me, which is if somebody has taken the time to write something to get into your organization, because they've seen there's value in getting into your secured network, do you think if they fail the first time, they simply go away? Anyone think that? No. So what I've got here, you'll probably remember Mandiant about 18 months ago released some research into APT1, which I'm sure all of you are aware is tied back to a specific unit within the Chinese army. And what I'll share with you here is the blue wavy line was actually the ongoing command and control communication we could see going on between compromised systems back to that command and control point in the year of 2011. And then what I've got here is the red line is 2012. And you can see where we released the APT1 report, which was making publicly available what it did, how it worked, and the context around it. So organizations like all of you here could go back and look at your estate to see if you were a victim. And what you see is this beautiful thing, as far as I'm concerned, that the communication flatlines. It stops. Brilliant, we thought. You know, we've made this public, and we've shut this thing down. Now, at the very right edge of the graph, as you look at it, you see the heartbeat start to pick up again. And actually, what we saw here is, if you look at the bottom half of this graph, all of these dots were the IP addresses that were involved in that command control communication, and each dot was kind of a reflection of that communication going back and forth. Then you kind of see the flat line. What you see above is new IP addresses, where the attackers basically rehoused their infrastructure into a new estate, and then after a few months, what we start to see is the return. Exactly the same techniques, exactly the same tactics, but just a regeneration, remorphing of what it looked like to beat all of those defensive controls that were based around collaborative experience. So how do we move forward from this? Is it an evolution or is it a revolution? Well, I want to share this because what kind of was really intriguing to me is the World Economic Forum put together a few years ago a group around cyber resilience. And what intrigued me was this was the first time I saw CEOs of companies actually going, this is pivotal and this is key. And this is actually their mission statement. And it's interesting, it doesn't talk about hygiene, it doesn't talk about defense, it doesn't talk about intelligence or anything else. What it talks about is resilience and response. There was an acceptance that things will get through, and actually their measure of success was how quickly we were able to respond when things occur. And I think that's a really good baseline to measure ourselves against. So how do we start to move on through this journey? Well, we always think of security as an evolution. And if I think back over the last 2 decades, what have we really done? We've built out layer after layer after layer of really friction, tools that made it harder for the attacker to get in the door. Now, the interesting challenge of that is we've built out so many friction layers. Now we've got to this kind of big data information overload. I've got so many things that could be bad. I now need to correlate these together into something of meaning. So we've built out our security operations centers, and the remit of that is to build the jigsaw puzzle. let me take information from here, and from here, and pull it together into something meaningful. The interesting part now is we've got so much information that we actually slow ourselves down. When I talk to a lot of organizations, they'll talk about it takes 4 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 10 hours to actually correlate this. That's a pretty large weight point to take the million down to the 2. And the key part of that is even when we get that kind of output and we go, this looks like something new, all we've done is to create a new question. So this looks like an attack. Well, what is it? What's it doing? So now we need to do the, if you like, the reverse engineering, the malware analysis to go, where's it talking back to? Is it using existing code? What's it trying to achieve? Because really what we want is to get to the actionable intelligence that says, is this just kind of smart hobbyists? I just want to shut them down and move on. Is this nation state? Actually, I might want to leave them running and send them into my tar pit so I can gather more intelligence about what they're doing, and the longer I can keep them busy in a safe way, the better it is for me. So the goal has got to be, how do we get to that action? And that's where we get to building out our incident response teams that are the people that actually drive that action. And so we now start to get to that bit of saying, well, what I need to be able to understand is not just the point of breach, but I've got to gather the intelligence after the breach to be able to play back. If they got into this system, how did they move laterally? Once they stole those credentials, what did they actually do with them? How much information did they exfiltrate? Where did it go to? Did they store it somewhere internally and then pump it out? So we now need to get into that, if you like, more introspective view of the world, which is both across our infrastructure, our devices, and really now I think this is where we start to turn the tables, which is moving away from defending to almost actively hunting out. But the key part of that is understanding who is it that we want to hunt down and why do we want to do that. Now, for me, a key part of that is, we all know this. This is kind of the typical kind of kill chain or life cycle of attack, depending whether you're a British citizen, I'd call it the life cycle, or if I was an American, this is the kill chain. Got to have it with, a bit of emphasis. But traditionally, as I said, we focus on this moment of time, the part of getting in the door. And actually, what we need to be able to do is to span across this entire life cycle, because to me, the key part of here is joining the dots up early to actually do the discovery, but more importantly, actually understanding the implications, which means I want to be able to look at the command and control. Is it using techniques I've seen before? Where's it going to? Who's behind it? And what have they actually achieved? Now, if I take the step forward to 2020, if you talk about the Internet of Things and the device explosion, the kind of typical figures that you'll see there in the industry is we will go somewhere between a 5-fold and a 10-fold increase in the number of IP addressable devices. Then I think of the number of events we're already gathering today. Think about how many, those of you that work in the SOC, how many events are you gathering today? Is it 10,000? Is it 1 million? Is it multiple millions? And then magnify that by 5 or 10-fold over the next 5 years. And then you think of all the new events we'll probably generate beyond that. And are we going to be getting 100 million events? Are we going to be getting to the billion events? I spoke to one organization recently, and they've peaked in a month at over 600 billion events. How do you process that in a timely way? So we need to kind of evolve our world. We're always going to try and do the prevention, all of the good hygiene. But actually the key gap for me is, how do I get better at self-discovery? How do I find the things that only impact me? Then how do I put context to it? How do I filter it down into the ones that are worth my time and effort? So I can then take the right response strategy. And if I can start to do that and join up the right bits of contextual information, what I then move is the ability to predict the things that are likely to be impactful to me. To achieve this, I need 3 things. And this, for me, is kind of probably the key part, because as a technology vendor, people always go, yeah, it's all about the product. But actually, in many ways, that's the easiest part. I need the technology to do the discovery, to do the forensics and all the other things, but actually, as these numbers grow, I need to be able to work smarter rather than throw more people at it. And that means having the right expertise and actually the right intelligence to make more meaning of that data. And that then pulls me back into this process of how do I achieve through that life cycle of analyze, resolve, detect, and prevent. Now, I want to leave you one final part, and I suppose this is my kind of 2-minute intro into how I think technology has to evolve. If I think of the journey we've come from, which was we started off on this route of going, I am going to wait for somebody to find it, pass it in the security industry, and they'll write me a solution, and we will learn from the greater good. And then we've moved towards behavior. I'm going to look for things that look suspicious. But the definition between suspicious and genuine is pretty gray. So what we've created is volumes of intelligence. So now we need to do better self-validation. And so this is where, and you'll see a number of different vendors out here starting to look at emulation. How do I actually see the problem in real time to take me from those millions, if not billions of events, down into something that I can quantify as being an actionable problem? And it sounds really simple to do this. All I've got to do is to take the attack, put it in a safe environment, and execute it. But actually, it's pretty sophisticated because attackers are savvy. If they don't see the click on the URL, they don't detonate. If they're in a virtual environment, they don't detonate. They'll send the attack down in multiple streams, so I've got to be able to correlate those together. So to build that environment that allows me to emulate through and do that validation that reduces the people and the time process, I need to have something that's pretty sophisticated. And I need to be able to do that across the discovery. And then I need to be able to correlate that back into actually where, how, and why, so I can start to drive my response. And to do that, I need to have gathered up the forensic information about the who and how those processes functioned, so I can work smarter and more efficiently and reduce that timeline of discovery and response down to something that's manageable. So takeaways. What are the takeaways for me when I think of 2020? Good hygiene is something we absolutely have to do. But good hygiene doesn't equal good security because things are going to get through. And we have to recognize, I think, that they are going to get more personalized, more focused, and that therefore means the impact is going to be greater, but it also then means we need to be better at doing our own discovery and our own response. More IPs, more security controls, means more friction layers, means more information, which actually means there's a danger that we're going to take longer to respond because we've got more information to process and we need more expertise. And that's, to me, where we need to not evolve. We need to go through the revolution. We need to think differently rather than keep doing the same thing. So we need to adapt. We need to look across the entire life cycle. And if we're going to deal with this volume, we need to be able to get to the answer quickly. And we need to have context with that answer that says, this is why this event, of the millions or billions, is the one that is going to be impactful and I should focus my time and energy on. So with that, let me say thank you very much. It is such a pleasure to be back here again. This is always, for me, I think, a highlight of the year, to come and spend time with people that truly live in the coalface and absolutely get the challenges we face. I will be around for the next couple of days, so if I can help you in any way, please come by the FireEye stand, and we can talk about golf swings. We might talk a little bit about cyber, but it'd be certainly great to meet you. Thank you very much.
Greg, thank you very much.
Thanks, Ian.
Great pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us. I think I'd probably need that.